Okay, Robert Warren here, author of The Bitcoin Miner's Almanac, and today we are talking about a model for every miner. Now, why are we talking about a model for every miner? I thought that every miner was just doing their own thing, making money, finding their own kind of secret sauce that they were then leveraging as aggressively as they could. Well, that seems nice in theory, but that's not how things work in practice. Everything can fundamentally be reduced to the simplest part of the mine, which is the machine, and then built back up to get a sense of what kind of asymmetry or what is the actual strategy a Bitcoin miner is using. So let's begin. In Bitcoin mining, you must have an edge. Now, what do we mean by that? We typically hear about this idea of an edge in the context of something like finances, financial services, trading. Oftentimes people say, if you have a trading shop, a prop shop, you have to have an edge. What do they mean by that? It's also the argument why people say, hey, you probably shouldn't just day trade your 401k and go full Wall Street bets on it because you don't have an edge. What do they mean by edge? An edge, they're not talking about some mystical, magical juju that you put into the universe. They're not talking about checking to see if the stars are aligned. They're talking about a discrete and repeatable strategy or a technique that allows you to, in some kind of asymmetric statistical way, so more than 51% of the time, know what an outcome is going to be that you can then dump money into and over the long run make money from the markets. So you have to have an edge. I want you thinking about this business and these businesses that we're going to go through in the context of what is their edge, what is their asymmetry, and then you'll start to understand from a first principles basis what are their limitations when it comes to operation. So let's review. This is in the Bitcoin Miner's Almanac. Also, hi, I'm Robert. I'm the author of the Bitcoin Miner's Almanac. You'll hear me referencing some of the stuff from the book, but we'll go over anything that is in the book here just to give you some context so that you're not kind of starting from too far back, right? So let's build an operating model for all Bitcoin miners. And now we distinguish initially between operating and this kind of establishing this kind of this full business model, the building, the OPEX versus the CAPEX. The reason for that is because, as you'll see later, there are a lot of ways to blow your business up in both the OPEX and the CAPEX side of things, but we're going to start with the OPEX side of things because that's where the machine starts. We're going to assume that the business is already running, and then we can kind of talk about how it was set up and if those capital expenditures propose or could potentially cause any risk to this quote-unquote business that you're running. So, an operating model for all Bitcoin miners. You have expenses and revenue sources that are moderated by certain factors. And those factors are tied directly to the machines themselves. Now, if you're thinking about mega mining, you start to batch in the expenses and revenue at higher volumes, so larger amounts of power that you are sucking up, larger amounts of revenue that you're generating. And then the things that moderate it, so your joules per terahash and your uptime, we're now thinking kind of in terms of the system. So not a single machine operating on a card table, but rather a large cooling loop system that then has its own kind of efficiency as it works in concert with the machine. So instead of thinking of it as a single machine, we can think of 2.5 megawatts of machines as a single system, just to keep this kind of conceptually neat. So first thing, expense. What is the biggest OPEX that people have? It is the cost of their input, which is electricity. Now, it is not always the case that it is quote-unquote an expense, because sometimes you find sources of energy that are a massive liability to the producer, and that person or entity is willing to pay you to take away that electricity. So this is what's really unique about Bitcoin mining, is that our main expense can also be a source of revenue. It can be an asset because we are solving another business's liability problem, which is that they have this electricity and they need it gone. They need it consumed for some particular reason. So that's the first one. Predominantly, people are paying for their electricity. There are all sorts of extenuating circumstances that we can go into, but generally speaking, electricity is going to be your largest expense as a Bitcoin mine. Now, how do we make the money? We make the money through generating hashes, hash price. So hash price is this very, very nice concept that was thought of prior to Luxor, but really formalized and established by Luxor and tracked by Luxor. And it is essentially the commoditized price of the work that you are doing. So if I have a 100 terahash machine, I can know essentially at any moment of the day what is the value of that work being done, my revenues. Now, this is variable for various reasons, one of which is the payout schemes and the pools that you go through and whether you are self-mining versus pool mining. But generally speaking, from a modeling perspective, your revenues are known. It's known, almost commoditized to this point, what the value of your hashes, the total terahash, the work that your system can do is. Now, what moderates those? Because there are two really key factors that moderate them. First, joules per terahash. Joules per terahash, if you remember your Bitcoin 101, is how efficiently your machine turns electricity into work. So if I input 100 watts, do I get 5 terahash out? All right, that's machine A. Well, let's talk about machine B. If I put 100 watts in and I get 20 terahash, that's 4 times as efficient. It has a lower joules per terahash, meaning I incur less of an expense, less electricity, to generate more revenue. Hash. And the second moderator is uptime. Uptime is the one that everybody likes to forget. At the end of the day, your uptime as a system or as an operator is highly determinant in your success as a business. The things that kill uptime are machine breakages, weather, curtailments, system breakages. And uptime, I think, is kind of a bit of a dirty secret in the industry because for the smaller guys, it's far easier to see if I have a machine that's not working and I can rush off and I can fix it up and I can make it work again. For the larger guys, when you're talking about systems or buildings that have tens of thousands of machines, you have to really be a tight operating ship, a system, a business, to be able to actually assay machines that are underperforming and diagnose and intervene in real time. So let's go through it from the high level and relate it to the machine. Expenses, that's one connection, physical connection the machine has, your electrical plug. That can also be a revenue generator, but most cases it's not. Revenue, hash price. That's essentially commoditized. You don't control that. It's known. Joules per terahash, that's contingent on not just the machine, but how you run the machine. So if the hash price is ripping, there are some cases where it makes sense for me to just want to get more hash so I could overclock my machine. I might lose some efficiency, but it doesn't matter. I'm making money hand over fist. There might be other cases where hash price is low. I'm not as profitable as I'd like to be, and I can underclock, and that may give me some additional efficiency joules per terahash for my machine. The other option is I just sell my machines and get new, more efficient machines. And the last piece, uptime, is also within my control. It's in my control in regards to how I build my facility, how I set it up, how I staff it, how I monitor it. This is kind of the stuff of the business, the operating sauce of the business, because the joules per terahash is very much contingent on the machine purchased and how you run it. But the uptime is very much contingent on your competence as an operator and your ability to set up systems that effectively cool these machines. So let's look through a couple of examples. First example, the BitX. Expenses moderated by joules per terahash, moderated by uptime, revenue, hash price. Now, your expense electricity, negligible. This is a hobby miner. This is something to get people into and learning about mining. So your expense is not really an issue. It's moderated by joules per terahash. These have relatively efficient chips. They are using some of the newer model chips from some of the newer model machines, and they tend to be pretty competitive in terms of their joules per terahash. But in terms of the electricity you put into it, you are oftentimes utilizing just your home rate. So if I'm using my home rate and it's 11, 12 cents per kilowatt hour, it doesn't matter how efficient I get because I'm not really being super quote unquote profitable as a business. It's moderated by my uptime. My uptime is not really consequential here. It sits in my room, it runs. I don't really have harsh environmental conditions that are hitting it in the face. And aside from the power going out maybe once a year at my house, it just keeps running. So I can control my expense, my joules per terahash, my uptime. So this is fundamentally a hobbyist business model where I'm enjoying this thing, I'm playing with it, I'm learning. I'm not trying to make a whole bunch of money, but I'm mining. I am mining and I am decentralized hash rate. Remember, you have to be making your own templates if you really want to be decentralizing hash rate. Or maybe it's just my little lottery miner. I'm just a lottery miner and that's what I want to do. But in any way, it's a fantastic educational tool. It's ideological in nature. It's not fundamentally a business that you're trying to run with a BitAxe. It's fun. And more people should be doing it because it's a wonderful way to make physical something that's very intangible, this whole Bitcoin thing. All right, next one. This is a fog hashing unit, beautiful single unit. On the left-hand side there, you see this container. This container holds an ASIC. You see a mess of electrical cabling going to, that's the red cabling, going to this thing that looks like a big power strip, your power distribution unit. There's a little monitoring unit there. And then you have this dry cooler, that thing on the bottom right-hand side. And we can kind of assume, based on the way this is set up, that this is a home setup. This is a home setup of some sort. And we see these big black cables. They don't just go from the unit that we have here on the left-hand side to that dry cooler, that thing with the fan on it, but they also seem to go outside through this hole in the wall on the far right-hand side. So it's doing something interesting, because what we know happens is that I put electricity into the machine gets hot, I keep it cool, I then produce some kind of heated liquid, and that liquid then has to be cooled to return eventually to the machine to cool it off again. So let's think through what a business model would look like for this, just from a first principles point of view. My expense is electricity. Just like the BitAxe, it's residential. Now, there are cases when I might have a high rate, I might have a low rate, I might have specific pricing based on time of day, but I'm paying residential rates, and I'm typically not able to negotiate that because I'm pulling 200, 400 amps to my house, and that's not a ton of power from the perspective of the utility. So I don't really have kind of a large leverage position as an operator to say, hey, could you give me a better rate? I'm kind of just paying retail. Now, what's it moderated by? It's moderated by uptime and joules per terahash. So joules per terahash, as we said in the BitAxe and before, depending on what kind of machine I put in there, I can hit a specific level of efficiency. That efficiency of operation can be kind of ramped up or ramped down. And the beautiful thing is that I'm moderating it with this closed system, this immersion cooled system, which means that I'm not really subject to a lot of the issues of large environmental risks. I don't have to have a giant dry cooler sitting outside. This looks like a semi-indoor space, like a basement or a garage. It doesn't look like I have to really worry about this thing getting gunked up or getting a bunch of dust in it or freezing over at some random point in time. My revenue is hash price. Now, there's something interesting that happens with fog hashing, because I don't control the hash price, of course, but it's my main source of revenue. But something happens when we use these kinds of systems, and it has to do with these black cables that go out the right-hand side of the image by what looks like some kind of spigot, some kind of faucet. I am not just consuming electricity and then generating this heat through the hashing process, which then has to be dealt with. I can not only use the input electricity. Let me say it in a different way. My output of this process is heat, and that heat to me is not just a liability. Typically, heat is something that is causing some kind of risk to your system, because when things get too hot, they shut down. What it looks like I'm doing here is I'm taking my follow through of this process, the result of this process, which is hashing and cooling, and that's some kind of heated liquid, and I'm sending it in as an input to another process. Now, in the same way that sometimes an electrical producer has a liability in their electricity that they produce, they have more than they need, they have to get rid of it, they turn it into an asset by us consuming it. You can go further downstream of that, and you can say, hey, there are other processes that require heat as an input. So things like if I want to run a loop through my driveway and heat my driveway so that it doesn't freeze over in the winter. Things like heating my pool. Things like heating my water heater. The input of low-grade heat happens not just in residential, but also in commercial life. So this is a situation where I'm not just getting a quote-unquote revenue source from hash price, but I'm also getting an offset on a cost structure for a totally different process, And so this adds a lot of complexity to the modeling, but in principle, you're using your liability, your risk, which is this heat that you produce and you have to deal with, as an input to another system. What's another example? Gridless compute. Gridless compute Eric Hirschman and his team are doing some beautiful work in Africa where they are going to hydro facilities and they are setting up mines on them with certain conditions. Okay, well, Gridless Compute is a functional business that provides a lot of utility to their to the communities that they serve. What's their expense? Their expense is electricity. Does that cost of electricity stay the same? No. The way that they get that electricity is that they are going to a resource that is a liability to the producer. They have all this hydro and they don't have a major consumer demand because these are typically very rural communities that don't really have enough stuff to plug into a 2 or 5 megawatt hydro facility. So they're able to go to a place where electricity is a liability and pay for it and negotiate an asymmetric positive rate, a very low rate, because they are helping somebody deal with their risk being all this electricity they're producing that they can't use. What's it moderated by? The efficiency of the machines that they put in. You can see they have some Watts miners in there. What's it moderated by? The uptime. So now when you start to get at scale, you are starting to have to contend with the risks associated with the environment that you operate in and the cooling that you have chosen. So they're using air cooling. It's far simpler. You can do it in remote areas. That is a positive. It's a trade-off. It's less efficient in cooling compared to hydro or immersion or two-phase, but it lets you just crank away and know that you're going to be hashing. Now, you can also see here that they are not using the top-of-the-line most efficient machine. Does that mean their business is going to fail and it's going to fall apart? No, absolutely not. They are in very rural communities where they are able to negotiate extremely low electricity rates. So by dropping the input cost, that expense of their electricity, they can trade off on the efficiency of their machine. Now, another trade-off they may have may be in total uptime. So uptime isn't just related to the weather. It's also related to the negotiations you have with the entity that provides your electricity. So in this case, there are times when the community needs more electricity. What does that mean? It means that you shut the machines down and you give it back to the community. Now, in an absolute sense, it would be bad if you could run all the time and you weren't, but this isn't the case. It's the case where Gridless is negotiating a value exchange where they say, we will provide you known revenues consistently at this really positive rate we're going to pay. And the trade-off for that is that you're going to give us a good rate, and then we are going to turn off when you ask us to provide that electricity to the community. So what I want you to really take away from this is that you're pulling levers and you're making trade-offs. I don't know how this business is capitalized or what the investment structure looks like or how that works. You don't need to know that to get a sense of the general trade-offs that a business can make. So you wouldn't go to Gridless and say, hey, you guys aren't running the most efficient machines, your business is going to fail. And the reason you wouldn't say that is because you don't understand their structure of their expenses and how it's moderated and what they're able to negotiate off of that. So I want you to think about this business as a more robust thing than just newest machines hashing away indefinitely. Understand that all these things listed on the left-hand side are negotiable. Another example is Riot's Corsicana facility. Another example is the TeraWulf facility. We're getting a little bit long now, so I'll just go through one of them. TeraWulf is an interesting example. It's getting into what you would consider a mega mine. They have an input, electricity. Obviously, it's more energy, more electricity that they're consuming than any of the other previous ones we've looked at. It's moderated by joules per terahash, so this is a publicly traded company. They have access to substantially more capital than a smaller or mid-sized miner would. They have also substantially more complex financials. They have highly trained CFOs that are able to realize these costs in very, very capital efficient ways. So they're able to go out and purchase really top-of-the-line efficient machines without incurring this huge liability of, oh, I've bought all these machines and now I'm kind of sitting on it waiting to pay it back. It's moderated by uptime, and of course their revenue predominantly comes from hash price. Now what's interesting about TeraWulf is that they are what we call behind the meter. So they have a negotiation with a nuclear plant where they are providing base demand. If you know anything about grids, you know that nuclear plants love to provide base load, just consistent power, but demand for that power changes. So TeraWulf is able to structure a deal where they're able to get some kind of trade-off, some kind of asymmetric positive rate, that would be a lower electrical rate, because they are not necessarily connected directly to the grid buying grid power, but they are buying power directly from the producer of that power. They are taking somebody's liability and they want to take it consistently. It's moderated by uptime. So I don't know the structure of their deal, if they have to curtail or what that looks like. It's typically very hard to curtail nuclear sites. But I imagine that they just want to crank this thing consistently. They want the uptime to be as maximal as humanly possible, which means that if I can get a great rate and I can have 100% uptime, I need to have tight operations, and I probably want to be buying more efficient machines, because my running time, it basically means that every second that I'm not operating, I'm losing money. Now, this differs from the Riot Corsicana facility, because while it's also a mega mine, it is not behind the meter. It's grid connected. So they have an exposure to an electricity price that is changing throughout the course of the day. So there are times when the cost of electricity is too high for even the most efficient machines inside these facilities to be profitable. So they have to curtail. So by them being able to get this floating electrical rate, they're on ERCOT, which is the particular Texas's energy management scheme, that particular grid. They're making that trade-off where they want this asymmetric low price of electricity. They're taking the volatility in the price. They're trying to put efficient machines, and so they have to get their uptime when they can, because they can't always have it all the time. Sometimes that price is going to go too high. They're going to have to shut down. So, why do mining businesses blow up? We won't go so much into that, but what I want you to take away from this is the idea that each of the examples that we went over are all discrete. They all have the same levers to pull, but if you pull them in different or inappropriate ways, you will blow yourself up. You can blow up by having too expensive machines. You overbought on your machines. You bought at the top of the cycle. Unfortunately, machine purchases are still cyclical. You're overstaffed. You have too many people. You overpaid on your facilities. You have a bad debt structure. We didn't even get to how people fund this with various debt or equity schemes. You modeled incorrectly. On your expenses side of things, you never manage your inputs. So you can control to some degree the cost of your electricity. It's something that you should manage. If you don't manage it, you are subject to it. Moderated by joules per terahash. Your machines might be breaking. You don't know the break evens of your machines, so you don't know when to turn on and turn off at any given time, or you don't even know how to monitor the cost of electricity. It's moderated by uptime. You're not operationally competent. You don't really know how to keep these machines hashing. You don't know how to repair them. Revenues, hash price. Hash price, well, yeah, you're not in control of your hash price, but if you were too aggressive on your modeling and you never modeled a substantial length of time where you had max pain downside, you're going to find yourself having a very bad time when inevitably that happens, because this is Bitcoin mining, and Bitcoin mining is known to do the most painful thing. So, an operating model for all Bitcoin miners. Your expenses, your input is electricity, that's negotiable. Your revenues, hash price, generally not negotiable. It's essentially an established commodity price that you are going to be paid for as you are doing work, as your machines are working. What's it moderated by? It's moderated by the efficiency of those machines, which to some degree is variable. A 10 to maybe 10% efficiency on the downside if you're doing some kind of fancy firmware or some underclocking or something like this. There are going to be times when you say, forget about it, hash price is so high, I just want to rip as hard as I can and make as much Bitcoin as possible. And it's moderated by uptime, your competence as an operator. And it all ties back to the machine. So whether you're looking at a whole facility or whether you're looking at an individual machine, you can scale these concepts to make sense for the size of what you're looking at. And that's what we've got. This is just a quick thought from Rob Warren, author of the Bitcoin Miners Almanac. Find me on Twitter, Bikes and Bitcoin. Laser Eyes recently moved on with us hitting 100K. Reach out, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it informative, and I hope it added a little more context into understanding what these various businesses are, what levers they're pulling, and what that means for the success of their business. Because for every business, there has to be a model, and they all have models, and they all make sense.